Down near the Persian Gulf, in the landscape that today forms much of Iraq, one of the world's earliest urban societies took shape. Later, Greek writers gave this broad region a name that stuck: Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. Those rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, begin far to the north in the highlands of Anatolia, then run for hundreds of kilometers through Syria and Iraq, feeding a flat alluvial plain before finally reaching the Persian Gulf. For thousands of years, that river system acted like a moving lifeline. It carried water, silt, fish, reeds, and people. It also carried danger, because in a low, open plain, a river can change its mind. When it floods, it does not just overflow, it can shift channels, cut new paths, and abandon old ones. To the north of the southern lowlands lay a region remembered in ancient names as Cimmerum. That name matters because it sounds like later Semitic terms used for the southern country, Shumerum, a word that eventually helped produce the modern label, Sumer. The Sumerians themselves had their own name for their homeland, Kiengi, a phrase that can be understood as the land connected to the En, the priest king who stood at the top of a city-state's religious and political life. In those early cities, authority was not separated neatly into sacred and secular worlds. Leadership was expressed through ritual, temple building, offerings, and the claim that human order was anchored to a divine order. The arrival of the Sumerians in the Gulf lowlands likely happened sometime after 4000 BC, but their deeper origins remain uncertain. Their language does not neatly match the surrounding language families, and that isolation has fueled debate for generations. Older theories pictured them moving inland from the coast, travelling upstream from the Persian Gulf. A different reconstruction is now often considered more plausible, that they came from the northeast of Mesopotamia and moved downriver toward the south. Even the presence of northern place names, that echo Sumer, has been treated as a faint clue, suggesting that communities connected to later Sumerian identity may once have lived further upriver before concentrating in the southern plain. When newcomers entered the Gulf environment, they did not step into an empty land. Signs of earlier populations survive in place names that do not sound Sumerian and seem to come from another language, now lost. Cities such as Uruk, Enheduana, and Shurupak preserve that older layer. River names also hint at complexity. The old Sumerian name associated with the Euphrates does not fit neatly into Sumerian word structure, while the Tigris name can be interpreted more easily, sometimes explained as a phrase like Blue River, built from terms for river and blue. None of this proves a single story, but it does show that the southern plain was already a meeting ground of peoples and tongues long before later empires tried to stamp the region with one identity. By the 5th millennium BC, farming settlements lined the two rivers. These early communities learned a demanding lesson. Rainfall alone could not sustain life there. Water had to be brought to fields on purpose. Canal systems diverted river water into irrigation networks, turning dry ground into workable farmland. The entire economy depended on the timing and behaviour of the rivers. In summer, the sun could be brutal and the land could crack and bake. In other seasons, the threat came from floodwaters that might rush across the plain, drowning crops, collapsing banks, and leaving families exposed. The rivers could nourish a settlement for decades and then, suddenly, undermine it by changing course. In that setting, daily survival required organisation, cooperation, and long-term planning. That pressure is one reason the region became a laboratory for early administration. Along the Persian Gulf coast, wetlands and swamps formed where the rivers dropped their silt. Reeds grew thick in those marshes and became one of the essential building materials of the landscape. Reed structures could be raised quickly and repaired easily, and they became closely tied to the sacred imagination as well. In Sumerian religious thought, watery places were not just geography, they were divine territory. The god Enki, associated with wisdom and the arts of magic, belonged to this world of fresh water, channels, and hidden depths. Tradition imagined him living in a subterranean freshwater realm called the Abzu, set beneath the Earth's surface yet distinct from the salty ocean beyond. One of Enki's major cult centres was Eridu, which in early times sat closer to the coast than it does today. Archaeology has revealed very ancient temple levels there, along with abundant fish remains, suggesting that fish offerings played a role in ritual life at the site. The picture that emerges is not a simple tale of priests and prayers, but a lived relationship between environment, economy, and belief. Ancient lists of kings, compiled much later, look back on Eridu as the first city of the inhabited world. These texts blend mythic memory with historical record. They describe kingship as something that descended from heaven, then moved from city to city, with each place holding authority for a time. After Eridu, other centres are said to have received the privilege of rule, and then the narrative hits a dramatic wall, a vast flood that ended an age. Flood traditions are not unique to Mesopotamia, and later biblical storytelling includes a famous version in which a righteous man is spared, while the rest of humanity is wiped away. But in the Mesopotamian telling, different divine characters drive the drama. The decision to destroy comes from Enlil, while the rescue is set in motion by Enki, who chooses to preserve a righteous ruler named Ziusudra, linked to the city of Shuruppak. In this account, Ziusudra receives detailed instructions to build a vessel capable of enduring catastrophe. Then, the storm arrives with overwhelming force. For days, the winds and waters batter the world until the land is flattened and the familiar boundaries between river, field, and settlement disappear. When calm finally returns, the boat is said to come to rest on a mountain. Birds are sent out to test the landscape, one after another, until the final bird does not return, signalling that the waters have dropped far enough for land to emerge again. Survival is followed by offerings and gratitude, and Ziusudra is rewarded with an extraordinary fate. Life extended beyond normal human limits. Stories like this do more than entertain. They express the region's deep awareness that water brings life and can also erase it in a single season, and they frame that reality as a moral drama under the supervision of powerful, unpredictable gods. After the flood, the old king lists claim that authority shifted to a long series of cities, beginning with Kish in the north, then eventually passing to Uruk. Uruk is where legend and archaeology meet in especially vivid ways. The lists record rulers whose names belong to epic memory as much as to history, most famously Gilgamesh. Uruk lay near the Euphrates, not far from the Persian Gulf, and over time it expanded into something the world had never seen before, a true city on a massive scale. By around 3600 BC, it covered several square kilometres and may have housed tens of thousands of people, protected by major defensive works. A city like that did not grow by accident. It required food supply systems, labour coordination, storage, craft specialisation, and authority capable of organising projects that lasted beyond a single season. The name Uruk itself proved remarkably durable. Across centuries of shifting languages and political borders, echoes of the old city name survived in later regional terms, and the modern place name Waka preserves a clear connection to the ancient city. Archaeological evidence indicates that by roughly 3400 BC, Uruk's defences were expanded into an impressive ring of walls and fortifications, with thick masonry and watchpoints. Inside the walls were not only dense habitation zones, but also open spaces, likely intended for cultivation and gardens. a reminder that even a city depended on agriculture and had to plan for shortages and siege. Uruk's citizens celebrated their walls. Epic tradition opens by pointing to those ramparts as a signature achievement, a monument that turned human labour into lasting stone and brick. The wall becomes a symbol of identity, proof that this place was protected, ordered, and meant to endure. That pride also reflects a broader urban reality. In early Mesopotamia, the city was not only a collection of houses, it was a machine for concentrating resources and people. It pulled in food from surrounding fields, drew raw materials from far away, trained specialists, and projected influence outward through trade and colonization. Trade is one of the clearest reasons Uruk became so powerful. Its networks stretched widely, and traces of Uruk material culture appear far beyond the southern plain. Cylinder seals, standardized vessels, and architectural styles show up across long distances, marking the movement of goods and ideas. Groups tied to Uruk travelled north toward the borders of Anatolia, east into what is now Iran, where they helped establish a strong presence at Susa, and westward in routes that may have connected, directly or indirectly, with Egypt through maritime corridors. This outward movement is often described as an Uruk expansion, but it can be imagined more concretely as a chain of outposts, enclaves, and trading stations threaded along routes that already existed. Donkey caravans carried commodities that mattered: copper, silver, stones, fibres, and finished textiles. The people linked to Uruk did not move empty-handed. They brought tools, craft knowledge, building practices, food habits, and the gods of their own city. In some places, they settled where population was sparse and built communities that looked like transplanted pieces of the southern world. In other areas, they lived as distinct quarters inside older local societies. One strong motive for pushing north may have been access to metals. Anatolia and neighbouring highland regions held rich sources of copper and silver, and evidence from Uruk itself includes signs of metalworking, as well as imported ceramics from northern Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the lands beyond. One excavated northern outpost, Habuba Kabira, illustrates how deliberate this expansion could be. Around 3200 BC, colonists established a settlement with straight streets and substantial walls, a planned community rather than a village that grew gradually. The choice of location makes practical sense. It sat in a zone where rainfall supported agriculture without intensive irrigation, and where open landscapes could sustain herding. Sheep and goats could be raised in large numbers, and crops like flax may also have been cultivated. This mattered because textiles were not a side activity in Uruk. They were a major industry. Large workshops depended on steady deliveries of wool and fibres, and that demand could shape entire regional economies. Within Uruk itself, administrative records and imagery point toward a workforce heavily involved in production, including many women engaged in spinning, weaving, and processing goods. The city needed food and raw materials to support these workshops, and it needed mechanisms to distribute rations and manage labour. Finished textiles moved back along the trade routes by caravan and were exchanged for metals and other valuables. In this kind of system, a city can function like a hub that pulls resources inward and sends products outward, reinforcing its dominance through economic gravity rather than only through warfare. The Uruk expansion lasted roughly 2 centuries, and then, surprisingly, it unravelled around 3200 BC. Some northern sites were abandoned outright, while elsewhere the southern newcomers blended into local populations or developed along different cultural lines. Connections with Egypt faded, and eastern enclaves shifted under local powers. The precise cause is still debated. One possibility is that mobile Semitic-speaking groups moved into the plain and disrupted the corridor that linked north and south, breaking the trade chain that had made the system profitable. Once northern Mesopotamia was cut off, it developed on its own trajectory, no longer tied as tightly to the southern model. Yet Uruk itself did not collapse. Instead, it adapted. If northern routes became unreliable, merchants could pivot toward the Persian Gulf, turning to maritime pathways and new partners. In later written sources, a distant land called Meluha appears, sometimes connected with the civilization that developed along the Indus River. The details are elusive because Indus writing remains undeciphered, and ancient references do not provide a clear map. Still, clues suggest some kind of contact. A small settlement in southern Mesopotamia later carried the name Meluha, and seals and iconography sometimes show animals associated with the Indus world, such as water buffalo. Later, rulers would even boast of ships arriving from faraway places, a political way of saying that the world's riches flowed toward the imperial center. Inside Uruk, sacred architecture anchored the city's identity. In its earliest phases, the urban landscape included two major districts. In the western quarter, Kulab, a sanctuary was dedicated to An, a sky god whose name could also serve as a general marker of divinity. His temple stood atop a high terrace, and later, excavators nicknamed it the White Temple because its outer walls were coated in pale plaster. In the eastern district, a major complex was devoted to Inanna, remembered as the mistress of a great sacred precinct known as Inana, a name that can be understood as House of Heaven. By around 3400 BC, monumental buildings in that precinct reached astonishing scale, with broad courtyards, processional spaces, and richly decorated walls that used coloured cones set into plaster to create geometric mosaics. From these precincts came some of the earliest clay tablets written in the new script. The content is revealing. Lists of deliveries, accounts of goods, records of allocations. It is the paperwork of an economy that had grown too large to manage by memory alone. The huge buildings associated with Inanna have often been described as temples, yet some scholars argue that the label may be too simple. They point out that these structures could also be administrative centres, workshops, or the grand houses of powerful families. In practice, the distinction may not have existed in the way modern categories suggest. Religious and economic life were woven together. Rulers claimed legitimacy through divine favour. Temples functioned as institutions with staff and resources, and the daily care of the gods blended seamlessly with storage, production, and redistribution. Inanna's presence was central to this world. Tradition imagined her cult life tied to a specific residence area, where the divine image was housed and where high-ranking temple personnel lived and worked, with kitchens, sleeping quarters, and workshops serving the needs of the sacred household. The city's myths praise the splendour of her precinct and treat it as a place where divine power visibly touched human architecture. Even when written versions of these stories were recorded much later, they preserve the memory of an older age in which Uruk's greatness was inseparable from the goddess who protected it. As Uruk's economy expanded, older administrative tools began to fail. Around 3400 BC, two innovations appeared that transformed how power and property could be tracked: the cylinder seal and the development of writing. Stamping technology itself was ancient. For a long time, stamps had been used to decorate textiles and mark ownership on pottery. But the cylinder seal took stamping into a new dimension. This small roller, often only a couple of centimeters long, was carved with intricate scenes. When rolled across damp clay, it produced a continuous frieze, a repeating signature that could not be easily forged once the clay dried or was baked. Seals were made from clay, wood, or stone, while the most prestigious could be cut from rare materials and mounted with precious metal. Owners wore them on cords or attached them to clothing, and they guarded them as personal identity and authority made tangible. The seal's practical use was straightforward and powerful. A vessel or chest could be covered, tied with cord, and then a lump of clay pressed onto the binding. The seal was rolled over that clay, leaving a mark that served as a guarantee of origin and an assurance that the container had not been opened. Storehouse doors could be secured the same way. To break the seal was to admit that the closure had been violated. In an economy of long-distance movement and large-scale storage, that kind of trust technology was revolutionary. Seals also became windows into daily life. Early examples show abstract motifs, but later ones depict people at work and in ritual scenes. Some show figures processing dairy, spinning thread, weaving on looms, and packing goods, often under supervision. Animals and symbolic creatures appear as well, hinting at ideas of household stability, prosperity, and fertility. Other images focus on herding and farming, cattle behind fences, milking scenes, and the handling of agricultural products. Over time, the seal shifted from being a simple mark of ownership to something closer to a personal signature used to validate contracts and correspondence. Seals could be inherited, modified, or reinscribed, and their images could be adjusted to reflect a new owner's status and identity. Writing emerged alongside these administrative pressures. Humans had always drawn, but drawing is not the same as writing. Writing begins when signs represent words of spoken language, not just pictures of objects. In Uruk, a critical step was taken when signs began to stand, for sounds and meanings in ways that could express ideas that could not be easily drawn. The earliest path toward this system likely ran through counting. Long before abstract numerals, people used small tokens to track quantities. A shepherd might use pebbles or shaped counters to represent animals, moving one token per sheep as a way to audit the herd. Across many sites, archaeologists have found such tokens, showing that this method lasted for millennia. In Mesopotamia, the system became more elaborate. Tokens could be sealed inside clay envelopes, creating a kind of tamper-resistant record of what was supposed to be delivered or returned. Seals protected these clay containers so that opening them would be obvious. But the method had a weakness. Once tokens were enclosed, people could forget what was inside. A clever adjustment followed. Tokens were pressed into the outer surface of the clay so the contents could be read without breaking it. Eventually, an even simpler leap was made. Instead of enclosing tokens at all, why not press the marks directly onto a flat clay tablet? The clay ball became unnecessary, and the tablet became the new medium of record. As transactions grew more complex, mere quantities were no longer enough. Administrators needed to record ownership, destination, and purpose. They began adding small icons that identified an institution, such as a temple, to indicate that goods belonged to that authority. Step by step, signs that began as pictures drifted towards signs that represented spoken words. A symbol for a concrete object could be repurposed because the word for that object sounded like a different word, allowing a kind of wordplay that turned pictures into language. This rebus-like logic made it possible to write actions and abstractions, such as paying or receiving, not just lists of sheep and jars. It was not a single invention dropped into the world fully formed, but a chain of practical solutions that, together, produced one of humanity's biggest leaps. The profession of the scribe emerged inside this system. A scribe shaped and held a tablet of wet clay, then used a reed stylus to incise signs. Over time, complex curves were simplified, because clay and stylus favour straight impressions. Signs became more angular, more efficient, and increasingly distant from the original pictures. Eventually, the scribe was not drawing as much as pressing the stylus to create wedge-like marks. That visual character is why modern scholars call the script cuneiform. In its earliest phases, the writing direction differed from later convention, and over centuries, the layout and orientation of signs changed as scribal practice standardized. Sumerian tradition even preserved a mythic explanation for the birth of writing, tied to a rivalry between the legendary ruler Enmerka of Uruk and the lord of Aratta. Messages were carried back and forth by a tireless messenger, but one instruction became too long and complex to memorize. Enmerka's solution was to shape clay and inscribe the message onto it. The recipient, confronted with the strange marks, could not read them. The tablet looked like a field of nail-like impressions, and without the skill to interpret them, the Lord of Aratta was left speechless. In this story, writing is not just a clever tool. It is a weapon of statecraft, a way to dominate a rival by controlling a new technology of communication. For centuries, the meaning of these wedge marks was lost to the modern world. European travellers copied inscriptions from monuments and brought sketches home, but without a bilingual key, the signs remained stubbornly opaque. The breakthrough came through a monumental inscription carved high on a cliff at Bisotun, in Iran. The text was written in 3 languages, and one of them, Old Persian, proved more approachable because it had fewer signs and was related to later Persian forms. A determined effort to copy the cliff text provided scholars with the comparative material needed to unlock the other versions, including Elamite and Akkadian. The story carved there was a royal proclamation by Darius, describing how he secured the throne. The practical question of whether ordinary people could read such a text mattered less than the symbolic power of writing itself. Inscribing an account into stone gave it authority, permanence, and a kind of sacred force. Once Akkadian could be read with confidence, another surprise emerged. Many Akkadian texts contained words and signs that did not belong to Akkadian at all. They pointed back to an older language, Sumerian. In the 3rd millennium BC, Semitic-speaking groups entered Mesopotamia, and their language, later called Akkadian, rose to prominence, especially under the dynasty associated with Sargon of Akkad. Sargon conquered the southern cities and absorbed a great deal of their culture, including their scribal system. In a pattern familiar from other eras, a prestigious written tradition outlived everyday speech. Sumerian continued to be written and studied long after it ceased to be the language of daily life, while Akkadian became the dominant medium for administration and diplomacy. For more than 2,000 years, Akkadian served as an international language across much of the ancient Near East, used in correspondence between kings and courts. From this growing body of texts, a complex religious world becomes visible. Before writing, only images survive, and their meanings must be inferred. After writing appears, the evidence is richer and more direct. The written record reveals a society that imagined the cosmos as crowded with divine and supernatural forces. Gods, goddesses, and lesser spirits were thought to manage every part of existence, from weather and fertility to crafts and kingship. Over time, thousands of divine names accumulated in tradition, suggesting an endlessly expandable, sacred landscape. Early figures may have been imagined as nature powers without fixed human form, but in the 3rd millennium, depictions increasingly show gods in human shape, marked by distinctive crowns with bull horns. The number of horns could signal rank, turning divine imagery into a visible hierarchy. The visual language of the gods also reflects political reality. As courts became more elaborate, gods were portrayed in ways that echoed royal life, while older demons and hybrid beings retained a more uncanny appearance. The king stood at the centre of this system, claiming privileged access to the divine realm. He built temples, appointed priests, and organised offerings, but he also used religion to legitimise authority and bind the city together. In the Sumerian world, belief was not a separate compartment. It was the framework through which people understood their rivers, their floods, their walls, their trade, their labour, and the fragile line between survival and disaster. Inanna was identified with the planet Venus, the brightest celestial body in the sky after the sun and the moon. She was also the patron goddess of Uruk, the city that would grow into the most powerful urban centre of its age. Yet Uruk was not devoted to her alone. Another ancient deity, An, associated with the vast dome of heaven, also had his seat there, and stood at the summit of the divine hierarchy in theory, but in myth, he appears distant and indistinct, almost withdrawn from active involvement. It is even possible that he did not originate within Sumerian tradition at all, but belonged to an earlier stratum of belief that the Sumerians inherited and absorbed. Far to the south lay Eridu, sacred to Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth. He was linked with wisdom, creative intelligence, ritual knowledge, and the hidden powers of fresh water. In stories preserved from later centuries, Inanna attempts to carry Enki's sacred powers away from Eridu to Uruk by boat. Beneath the mythic surface, this tale may reflect rivalry between the two cities, each promoting its own divine protector as supreme. As time moved into the third millennium, another god rose steadily in prominence, Enlil, whose name can be understood as Lord Air. Enlil governed the realm between heaven and earth, the invisible space that held the world together. His sanctuary stood in Nippur, a city regarded as the cosmic centre, the place where the axis of the world and the pillar of heaven were believed to stand. Together, An, Enlil, and Enki formed a powerful triad. Between them, they divided authority over sky, air, and the subterranean waters. Each was imagined to hold a distinct path across the heavenly dome, along which celestial bodies such as the sun, moon, and planets moved in orderly procession. In the earliest phases of Sumerian religion, the gods were not clearly defined as male or female. The Sumerian language itself does not mark grammatical gender in the way many later languages do. Words that could mean son or daughter, husband or wife, did not carry fixed masculine or feminine endings. Over time, however, the gods became increasingly human in character. By the third millennium, they were portrayed in human form with recognizable personalities and relationships. Only a few deities, such as An and the sun god Utu, retained names that stood alone. Most others were addressed as Lord or Lady, titles that emphasized rank rather than personal identity. Inanna was styled Lady of Heaven. The moon god Nana, her father in later tradition, was called Lord Heaven. As myth developed, the gods were arranged into a vast extended family. Consorts were assigned, though these divine spouses often remained shadowy figures. Ningal, Great Lady, became the wife of the moon god, and therefore mother of Inanna. Utu, the sun, was counted among the moon god's children and so became Inanna's brother. Enlil's wife was Ninlil, Lady Lil. As Enlil's importance increased, theologians and scribes elevated him to the position of father of the gods, placing him at the head of a structured divine lineage. The world imagined by Sumerians and later Akkadians was shaped like a flat disk floating upon a vast body of fresh water. Beneath it lay another ocean of salt water. Above arched the solid dome of heaven. The stars and planets were sometimes described as the livestock of the moon god, moving across the sky as herds across pasture. At the edges of the known world stood distant mountains, the realm known as Kur, associated with death and the far horizon. In later thought, the netherworld came to be located beneath the Earth's surface, entered in the west, where the sun vanished each evening. Only in death could humans enter that land of no return. The sun itself travelled through that hidden realm each night, moving invisibly from west to east, before emerging again at dawn. On carved seals, the sun god is shown rising between mountain gates, rays flashing from his shoulders, a saw held in his hand as he cuts his path into daylight. The cosmic order was never secure. Ancient tradition imagined a universe threatened by chaotic forces that had existed long before the present generation of gods. Illness was attributed to hostile spirits. Strange composite creatures appear on seals, locked in combat with heroic figures or celestial animals. These images may also reflect observations of the heavens, where constellations rise and fall in seasonal cycles. The bull and the lion, prominent on seals, have often been linked to the constellations later known as Taurus and Leo, which mark turning points in the agricultural year. The sky itself was a battlefield of symbols, a reflection of earthly struggle. When Semitic-speaking Akkadians entered the Mesopotamian plain, they did not erase Sumerian belief. Instead, they adopted it. They kept the writing system and incorporated Sumerian deities into their own, more streamlined pantheon. Nana became known as Sin. Utu was called Shamash. Inanna was identified with the Akkadian goddess of Venus. Divine names shifted languages, but the underlying figures endured. By the late 4th millennium, Uruk had grown into an unprecedented metropolis. The tablets discovered there speak primarily of economic matters, rather than grand narratives. Temple scribes recorded deliveries of grain, oil, and beer, noting quantities and sometimes the names of officials responsible. The origin of these goods is not specified. They may have come from temple lands, from rents owed by cultivators, or from contributions demanded of surrounding communities. The records show an institution deeply engaged in production, storage, and redistribution. In this administrative environment appears one of the earliest traces of Inanna's presence. Her written sign is distinctive. Rather than spelling her name in full, scribes used a single emblem that represented her. The symbol resembles a tall standard ending in a curved flourish, sometimes accompanied by another sign, indicating exalted status. The combination could be read as Exalted Inanna or Majesty Inanna. The earliest visual representation of the goddess does not show a human figure, but this very emblem, suggesting that the object itself carried sacred meaning. The exact origin of this symbol remains debated. It appears frequently in scenes of agricultural abundance. On seals, it stands near enclosures filled with livestock or beside towering storage jars. Reliefs show it rising from the roof of reed structures where animals are kept. In one scene, a figure, likely female, holds the standard while standing near massive jars. The scale indicates that the object was as tall as a person. Early scholars propose that such standards were fashioned from bundled reeds bound together into a pillar-like form and erected at sacred locations, perhaps where floodwaters had receded and fertile ground re-emerged. Later, as temples were constructed in durable materials, the standards of particular gods were placed beside entrances as identifying emblems. Each major deity had a distinctive form. Inanna's was characterized by its curved top and flowing plume. Over time, these standards were stylized into written signs and eventually simplified as the script evolved. Inanna's emblem was associated with the term em-ash, a word connected with radiance, brilliance, and shimmering light. The brilliance of Venus in the twilight sky may have inspired this association. Hymns describe her wearing a radiant crown compared to gleaming stone or to a constellation of stars. Later, astrological texts mention occasions when Venus appeared with a luminous halo. The image of a shining diadem likely captured both her celestial identity and her royal authority. The meaning of her name has long been discussed. Interpreted as Lady of Heaven, it fits her association with Venus and the sky. In early periods, her gender may not have been firmly fixed, but by the 3rd millennium she emerges clearly as a goddess. Her name was often avoided in direct speech. Ancient people treated divine names with caution, fearing misuse or offence. Circumlocutions were preferred, such as goddess of the palace or goddess of the land. Even her written sign may have functioned as a respectful substitute for full pronunciation. She was frequently addressed as Majesty, a title that appears in early offering lists from Uruk. The epithet may reflect her elevated position in the divine hierarchy, or perhaps the brilliance of her planetary manifestation. Around 3000 BC, additional designations appear that correspond to Venus as morning star and evening star. In some contexts, these aspects seem almost distinct, with separate festivals marking their appearances. As an inner planet, Venus alternates between western evening visibility and eastern dawn visibility. The Sumerians tracked these cycles carefully, associating them with divine agency. Another epithet links her to the mountain. When Venus rises in the east before dawn, it seems to skim above the Zagros range before fading in the strengthening light. A hymn celebrates her appearance over the mountains, spreading radiance across earth and sky. The mountains thus became a poetic birthplace for the goddess in myth. One controversial title applied to her in later texts is New Gig. Earlier interpretations translated this as a term implying ritual servitude, but such translations are no longer widely accepted. The linguistic components suggest meanings connected with separation, taboo, or sanctity. The word could refer to someone set apart from ordinary life, whether in sacred service or because of ritual restriction. Applied to Inanna, the title appears to emphasize power and distinctiveness, rather than subordination. A different theory once proposed that her name referred not to heaven, but to date clusters, since the Sumerian word for heaven can also be connected in some contexts with fruit. This interpretation has not gained general acceptance, yet it highlights an undeniable link between Inanna and the date palm. The date palm was indispensable in southern Mesopotamia. It thrived in extreme heat, tolerating saline soils and drawing water from irrigated ground. Every part of the tree could be used: fruit eaten fresh or dried, syrup produced, flour stored, pits fed to livestock, fibres woven, even beverages fermented. In art and hymn alike, the date palm appears as a symbol of fertility and prosperity. Artificial pollination of date palms was practiced in antiquity. Farmers transferred pollen from male to female trees to increase yield. The process was understood as a form of sexual union, and the language used for animal breeding was applied to plant fertilization as well. Such acts naturally fell under the symbolic domain of Inanna, who was associated with love, desire, and generative power. Some scholars have suggested that her curved standard may be a stylized representation of date clusters hanging beneath the palm fronds. On many seals, women are shown engaged in pollination, reinforcing the association between the goddess and agricultural fecundity. Inanna's presence is also marked by the rosette, a star-like emblem with multiple petals. This motif later became associated more broadly with divinity, but it remained especially tied to her. On reliefs, the rosette appears beside her standards and livestock, indicating animals belonging to her domain. Archaeological finds from Uruk include rosette ornaments discovered in areas identified with her cult, supporting the connection. The lion became another enduring symbol. On vessels and seals, her standard stands between lions, and later images show her resting a foot upon a lion's back. The animal conveyed strength, dominance, and untamed force, qualities that matched her character in myth. Gradually, Inanna took on a fully anthropomorphic form in art. Early depictions of goddesses are difficult to distinguish from noble women, as clothing and posture are similar. By about 2300 BC, divine figures can be identified by horned crowns, circular diadems adorned with bull horns. In some early reliefs, a goddess with vegetal stalks rising from her shoulders holds date clusters, symbolizing abundance. Whether these images represent Inanna or another fertility goddess is not always certain, since iconographic conventions overlapped. On steles from Lagash, a seated goddess, larger than surrounding figures, receives the homage of a ruler. Inscriptions identifying temple construction suggest that in at least some cases, this enthroned figure is indeed Inanna. Even in these early images, she appears closely linked with royal authority, a relationship that would define her role for centuries. Later, seals show her standing upon mountains with wings spread, reinforcing her celestial aspect. She may appear alongside Utu the sun god and Enki, with streams of water flowing from his shoulders. In another image, she restrains a lion while guiding a plough, uniting wild power and cultivated fertility. The symbolism underscores her influence over both nature and agriculture. As Uruk's political and economic stature expanded, its goddess rose with it. Whether she had always belonged exclusively to Uruk is uncertain. Myths connect her with distant Arata beyond the mountains, suggesting older layers of worship that predate urban consolidation. It is possible that groups migrating from eastern highlands brought her cult into the southern plains. Within Uruk, she shared space with An, whose mythic role remained subdued. And may represent an older divine order that was not entirely displaced, but gradually overshadowed by more dynamic figures such as Inanna and Enlil. Picture a world 5,000 years in the past, in the flat riverlands where the Euphrates and Tigris turn mud into harvest. The people of Sumer did not leave behind diaries or personal confessions. What survives are images carved into stone and clay, and short records made for counting grain, beer, animals, and labour. Those records were practical, not poetic. They were never written to explain beliefs or emotions. Yet, once writing existed, a new door opened. Myths, hymns, and ritual memories could finally be fixed into words. Before that moment, the best clues come from art, scenes that begin to look less like decoration and more like storytelling. Around 3000 BCE, cylinder seals and carved reliefs start to show sequences: a procession, an offering, a sacred threshold, a figure receiving gifts. One of the most striking objects from this period is a tall alabaster vessel, known today as the Uruk vase. Even without a single line of explanation carved beside it, the vase reveals an entire worldview built around water, fertility, abundance, and the power of a goddess whose presence shaped the life of a city. The vase was found inside the sacred precinct of Uruk, in an area tied to major religious buildings. It had been stored carefully with other valuable items, as if placed there on purpose rather than discarded. Such collections can form for different reasons. Sometimes, older ceremonial objects are buried when a new building phase begins, treated with respect because they remain holy even when no longer used. Sometimes temple wealth is hidden in a moment of danger, kept out of reach of thieves or invaders. Whatever the reason, the vessel survived long enough to be uncovered in modern excavations, later suffering damage in recent conflict, and then returning to view again. that modern history only sharpens the sense that the object has always been contested, valued, and vulnerable. The surface of the vase is arranged in horizontal bands, like a moving scroll. At the bottom appear flowing lines of water. Above the water rise plants, grain stalks and branches that evoke the river's edge and the irrigated fields beyond. In this one band, the whole economy is already present. No river means no canals, and no canals means no harvest. The water is not just scenery, it is the foundation. Above the plants come animals, sheep and rams in orderly rhythm, a repeating pattern that feels like herding, breeding, and wealth made visible. Then, in the next band, the human procession begins. Naked men stride forward carrying baskets and bowls piled with produce. One carries a spouted vessel that suggests ritual pouring. Their nudity is not casual. In many ancient societies, the body itself can become a sign of purity in sacred space, stripped of ordinary clothing and status markers. In such settings, the goal is to remove anything profane before approaching the divine. The message is simple. Sacred ground demands a different state of being. The upper section is damaged, but enough survives to sense the climax. A leading figure once stood at the head of the procession. Only fragments remain, including part of a garment pattern and a long belt held by an attendant. That detail matters. Other images from Uruk show a prominent man wearing a distinctive net-patterned skirt, often accompanied by a smaller follower in a similar but shorter garment. The repeated pairing is hard to ignore. It suggests rank, mentorship, and public performance. A central authority and a close subordinate moving together through ritual scenes. On seals from the same cultural world, this net-skirted figure appears feeding animals with branches, standing near rosettes, and operating beside tall storage jars. The setting often includes a sacred emblem associated with Inanna, the goddess of Uruk. Those emblems can stand like towering standards beside pens, storehouses, or temple facades. Instead of a portrait of a goddess, the sign itself announces her presence. The symbol functions like a flag, a name, and a divine signature all at once. The Uruk vases also shows a woman at the threshold of a structure packed to the roof with abundance. She receives the procession's gifts and raises her hand toward her face in a greeting gesture. The scene invites a question that has never been fully settled. Is this woman the goddess herself, or a high-ranking priestess acting in her place? Both possibilities fit the world of early Mesopotamia. In later periods, gods are shown with clear divine crowns and dramatic attributes. But early art often blurs the boundary. A divine being can appear standing. A human official can sit on a throne. Ritual gestures can be used by both. In the earliest centuries, the goddess may not have been depicted as a human figure at all, because her standards already represented her. That would make the woman at the doorway a human agent, a temple leader receiving offerings for the deity whose symbols rise behind her. At the same time, the woman's elevated position and the presence of the sacred signs create a charged ambiguity. Early Sumer did not separate religion from governance. The temple was economy, law, ceremony, storage, labor organization, and divine presence in one. A priestess could be a political figure. A ruler could be a ritual specialist. The image does not need to fit modern categories to be meaningful. This is where the titles of early Sumer become important. The term, often translated as En, points to a kind of leadership that is both sacred and administrative. In later times, it can mean priest, ruler, or high-status official. In the earliest layers, it seems to carry the weight of stewardship over fertility and order. Crops, herds, and the well-being of the city were not simply practical matters. they were seen as outcomes shaped by divine favor, ritual correctness, and the right person standing in the right place at the right moment. Alongside the N appears another title, Nin, meaning lady or mistress. A Nin is not merely a spouse in a private sense. It can mark a high-status female role tied to temple authority and ritual responsibility. In a world where surplus must be collected and redistributed, where textiles are produced at scale, where labour is coordinated, a leading woman can stand at the centre of real economic power. The imagery from Uruk supports this. Scenes show women near storage, ceremony, and emblematic objects that represent divine ownership. Some early traditions hint at a paired leadership, a male En and a female Nin functioning together in ceremonies meant to renew abundance. Such rites would not be surprising in an agrarian society, dependent on irrigation and seasonal cycles. The logic is straightforward. If nature is fragile, then ritual becomes a technology for stability. If prosperity depends on forces beyond human control, then public ceremony becomes a way to negotiate with those forces. Over time, the balance shifts. The paired figures fade, and the leading male figure becomes dominant in the imagery, still accompanied by a subordinate, but now linked more directly to the goddess herself. The ruler becomes the primary human partner of the city's divine patron. In this model, authority is not only inherited or seized, it is granted, confirmed, and renewed through divine relationship. That relationship takes on its strongest form in the idea later known as the sacred marriage. In this concept, the ruler's legitimacy is sealed through a ceremonial union with the goddess. Not necessarily as a literal event, as modern audiences might imagine it, but as a public ritual of fertility, renewal, and political authorization. The gifts carried in processions, the abundant food, the vessels for pouring, and the dramatic approach to the temple threshold all fit a world where the ruler receives the right to rule by entering the sacred space under the goddess's sign. The ideology behind such scenes becomes even clearer in royal imagery that casts the leader as shepherd. On seals, the same net-skirted figure tends animals, feeds them, and protects them. In other scenes, he is a hunter aiming his weapon at wild predators. The symbolism is direct. The people are the flock. Danger is the wilderness. The ruler is the watchful guardian. The message is not subtle. Order must be defended. Prosperity must be maintained. Leadership is justified by care and protection, and also by force when necessary. There are also darker images from early Mesopotamia, showing prisoners and violence under a supervising figure. Those scenes may relate to control, intimidation, or the sealing of official spaces such as doors. Whatever their immediate function, they remind the viewer that early states were not gentle. They were competitive, hierarchical, and sometimes brutal. Ritual and violence could exist in the same political system because both served the same end, keeping the city intact. Legendary stories reinforce this worldview. One famous cycle describes a ruler of Uruk locked in rivalry with a distant lord beyond the mountains. Both claim the favour of Inanna. Both speak as if the goddess chooses a partner on earth, and that choice determines who truly holds authority. In such tales, the goddess is not an abstract symbol. She is an active power whose preference can elevate one king and humiliate another. The city's triumph becomes proof of divine approval. Another strand of tradition links Inanna with a shepherd lover whose gifts are the produce of the land. In love songs, the goddess is not distant. She becomes a young woman preparing for union, receiving baskets of abundance at the doorway of a sacred household. These songs transform political theology into intimate drama. Yet the logic remains the same. Union with the goddess means life, fertility, and stability for the community. a different tale presents Inanna in an even more human emotional register. The story of a sacred tree carried from the river and planted in her garden. Time passes. The tree grows, but dangerous beings claim it. A serpent settles in the roots. A powerful bird nests in the branches. A dark presence takes the trunk. Inanna mourns because the tree was meant to become the materials of her throne and bed, symbols of rule and sacred intimacy. Help does not come from the expected direction, but from the hero of Uruk, who drives the intruders away and turns the wood into objects of authority and ritual power. Here, the cosmic and the political merge again. A tree becomes the axis between sky and earth, and the hero becomes the protector not only of a city, but of the goddess's order. Across these stories and images, a consistent pattern emerges. Inanna stands above other city deities in a special way because she is the one who can grant legitimacy through union. Her symbols appear beside storage. Her rosette marks divine ownership. Her lion signals power. Rulers approach her with offerings, and the city's prosperity is framed as the outcome of her favour. Centuries later, new empires rise and languages change, but the structure of the idea remains. Inanna is renamed, reinterpreted, and absorbed into broader pantheons, yet she continues to appear as the giver of authority. In palace art, a goddess stands with a lion beneath her, weapons rising like living emblems of force, while she extends the signs of rule to a king. Flowing water and plant life surround her, not as decoration, but as a declaration. Legitimate power is expected to bring abundance. The image is a contract written in symbol rather than ink. In early Mesopotamia, a temple was not a gathering place for the public. It was not designed for communal worship in the way later religious traditions would understand it. The temple was the dwelling of a god. Access to its inner chamber was tightly controlled. Only the ruler and appointed priests could approach the divine image, and even they were required to undergo strict purification rituals before doing so. Ordinary people remained outside the sacred core, offering prayers from the outer courtyard or beyond the walls of the sanctuary. As cities expanded in southern Mesopotamia during the late 4th millennium BCE, the role of the temple changed dramatically. Uruk, which had grown into one of the largest urban centres of its time, transformed not only physically but socially. The Inanna district became the centre of immense building projects. Written tablets from this period reveal intense economic activity, centred in these sacred precincts. Vast tracts of agricultural land, enormous herds of livestock, and extensive storehouses were administered from within the temple complex. The earliest administrative tablets show meticulous accounting. Grain deliveries were recorded in detail. Herds of cattle, sheep, and goats were counted and redistributed. The temple oversaw ploughmen, ox drivers, shepherds, fishermen, brewers, bakers, cooks, leather workers, and textile labourers. Women processed wool and flax into thread and cloth. Craftsmen worked wood, stone, silver, and imported metals. Traders transported goods along river routes and desert tracks. Scribes documented every transaction. Even singers, ritual specialists, and snake charmers appear in these records. In this environment, distinctions between sacred and secular blurred. The temple was a religious institution, but it was also an economic engine. Archaeologists often struggle to distinguish between palace and temple structures, because both functioned as centres of authority, storage, and administration. Political and religious power were deeply intertwined. Yet monumental temples were not the only sacred spaces. Cylinder seals from the same era depict much simpler shrines. These are small reed structures standing in open areas, marked by divine standards. Processions approach them, bearing offerings. Some participants are nude, likely in ritual purity. The large dominant ruler figure seen in other imagery is sometimes absent. Instead, ordinary worshippers, including women, appear prominently. One scene shows a woman seated on a raised platform with arms lifted in prayer. 3 divine standards stand before her. Her elevated position suggests leadership within the ritual, possibly as a priestess. These images hint at forms of worship that coexisted with official temple administration, traditions rooted in older community practices that survived alongside the emerging urban elite. The rise of cities reshaped society. In earlier village life, kinship networks provided social stability. Land was abundant, and families could relocate easily. But as cities grew along riverbanks, irrigation allowed unprecedented agricultural surplus. Surplus created trade. Trade generated wealth. Wealth created inequality. Merchants travelled long distances, returning with rare materials and exotic goods. Some families accumulated power and influence. Social divisions deepened. A new elite emerged, and with it, a new worldview. This elite invested heavily in monumental architecture, presenting themselves as uniquely favoured by the gods. Religion became a language of legitimacy. Political authority may initially have been shared among influential families. But over time, leadership consolidated in the hands of a dominant ruler. This leader claimed special selection by the city's patron deity. Images show him hunting lions, defeating enemies, supervising construction projects, and making offerings to the gods. He appears as protector, warrior, and mediator between divine and human realms. The metaphor of the shepherd became central. The ruler tends his flock, feeds and defends it. Subjects are cast as livestock under his care. Such imagery served as powerful political symbolism, reinforcing obedience and hierarchy. Meanwhile, everyday religious life continued in domestic settings. Families built small household shrines. Ancestors were buried beneath floors. Pipes were constructed to pour offerings of water to the dead. At the end of each lunar month, families gathered to honour departed relatives. Protective spirits were invoked and small figurines buried at thresholds to guard against malevolent forces. Women often played key roles in these household rituals, mediating between the living and the unseen. In Sumerian language, the word for temple was simply the word for house. The god's dwelling was conceived as a house like any other, though sacred. Early shrines resembled modest reed huts. Over time, these developed into larger reed houses, and eventually into monumental structures built of brick. Even so, the symbolic memory of the reed hut endured. The reed hut carried associations of protection, shelter, and even birth. In some traditions, childbirth occurred within such structures. The imagery of enclosure and renewal connected the hut to ideas of creation. When divine statues were crafted, sculptors withdrew into special reed workshops. Rituals accompanied the creation process, treating the statue's completion as a form of birth. As urban society matured, temples were raised upon terraces. These elevated platforms eventually evolved into the stepped structures later known as ziggurats. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, which served as tombs, Mesopotamian ziggurats functioned as elevated temples. Built of mud brick with baked brick exteriors, they rose in receding tiers. Stairs allowed ascent to a shrine at the summit. The summit shrine often retained the conceptual form of the ancient reed sanctuary. Decorated with precious materials and aromatic wood, it marked the earthly residence of the god. The height symbolized proximity to the heavens. Priests ascending the terraces physically enacted the approach toward the divine. By the 3rd millennium, temple institutions operated vast economic networks. Livestock had to be carefully bred and fattened for sacrifice. Workers received rations from temple estates. The temple fed its staff and supported specialized labor. It was both religious center and redistributive economy. City rulers relied on temple ideology to bind urban populations together. Diverse ethnic groups now lived side by side. Loyalty to clan alone was insufficient for maintaining order. Allegiance to the city god, represented by the ruler, became a unifying force. The ruler acted as intermediary, claiming divine backing for his authority. The gods themselves were imagined as sovereigns dwelling behind thick walls or atop elevated terraces. Their statues, often hidden behind curtains, were treated as living beings. Through elaborate rituals, priests symbolically opened the statue's senses, its eyes, mouth, and nose, granting it divine presence. These ceremonies invoked imagery of childbirth, reinforcing the idea that the statue was not crafted, but born. Once consecrated, the statue required daily care. It received meals in formal service. Tables were set before it, water was offered for washing. Meat, bread, fruits, and drink were presented in prescribed order. Musicians performed. Incense filled the air. After presentation, the blessed food was redistributed, often to the ruler, reinforcing the bond between divine and royal authority. Temple archives from the city of Lagash provide insight into daily operations. The temple of the goddess Bao owned orchards, barley fields, and livestock. Fishermen operated under temple leases. Brewers, bakers, metalworkers, and scribes worked within its administration. Women managed textile production and animal husbandry. Temple workers were paid in rations of grain. The ruler's wife frequently oversaw major temple departments, especially those connected to women's quarters. Administrative tablets reveal that economic management often overshadowed explicitly religious concerns. At times, rulers attempted reforms. One king accused his predecessors of misusing temple property for personal gain. He claimed to restore assets to their rightful divine owners and dismissed corrupt officials. Such declarations projected the image of a just ruler defending widows and orphans. Yet reforms often had limited impact, and economic and religious spheres remained deeply intertwined. Temple offices became hereditary in powerful families. In Nippur, a priestly lineage controlled the highest temple administration for generations. One family's internal conflict illustrates the risks of concentrated power. A son accused his father, a leading temple official, of serious misconduct. At first, the accusation seemed credible. Later, it failed. In a legal system that punished false capital charges with death, the son paid with his life. This episode reveals a world where religious authority, legal judgment, and political favour intersected. High office brought prestige, but also danger. Temple leadership was both sacred calling and political battleground. By the height of Sumerian civilization, the temple stood at the centre of everything: economy, politics, ideology, and ritual. Its walls enclosed not only a god, but the structure of society itself. Behind curtains and above terraces, divine authority was staged, maintained, and reinforced daily. In the earliest layers of Mesopotamian history, the goddess Inanna is everywhere and nowhere at once. Her presence seems to hang over the great city of Uruk, especially in the vast sacred district that doubled as an economic powerhouse. Storehouses, workshops, and monumental buildings filled that temple zone, and yet the exact location of Inanna's own sanctuary remains uncertain. Many researchers suspect a major building, often called the Red Temple, was connected to her, but certainty is rare in this period. The city's records and images suggest devotion, administration, and ritual, but they do not point clearly to a single room that can be named, without doubt, as Inanna's house. Further north along the Euphrates, however, the picture becomes sharper. At Mari, excavations uncovered multiple temples linked to Inanna and her close relatives. In that region, the local language and culture were not purely Sumerian. Akkadian speech and Semitic traditions were strong, and that matters because divine names shifted as they crossed linguistic borders. In Mari, several closely related goddesses appear under distinct titles. Small votive figures carry names that identify three separate cults, one called Inanna, another called Inanna, and a third known as Ishtarat. Untangling these names is difficult because they may reflect different aspects of Venus, different local traditions, or different ways of blending Sumerian and Akkadian religion. One plausible interpretation sees Inanna as a form of Inanna connected to the morning star, remembered in a tradition where Venus could be addressed in masculine terms. Inanna may represent the evening star aspect, understood more clearly as female. Ishtarat may point toward a northern Semitic goddess, related to the wider Ishtar family, a figure whose influence would later echo across Syria and beyond. Whatever the exact distinctions were, Mari shows that Inanna was not a single fixed idea. She was a living power, shaped by place, language, and the needs of the people who sought her favour. Mari itself was an unusual city. It stood on the Euphrates in a zone where farming could never fully dominate life. The surrounding land pushed toward desert, and irrigation could only do so much under harsh sun and fast evaporation. Agriculture existed mainly on the narrow strip along the river, so Mari's success depended on something else: position and movement. The city sat on a vital corridor for river traffic between Syria and southern Mesopotamia. A canal system improved navigation and helped supply water to parts of the settlement. Industry mattered too. Archaeology reveals widespread bronze working, suggesting a city plugged into long-distance exchange. Tin, essential for making bronze, moved along these routes from distant sources, including Anatolia and lands to the east, feeding the workshops of towns, up and down the Euphrates. Compared with some southern cities, Mari left fewer written records for the early 3rd millennium, so its political story is harder to reconstruct. A handful of royal names survive, and the evidence suggests Akkadian-speaking kings ruled there. The urban landscape combined palace and temple in a tightly bound system. A dominant temple complex honoured the city's chief god, often thought to have been a storm deity worshipped widely in the north. The palace stood close by, emphasizing how governance and divine authority were woven together. Within the city's sacred geography, the temples associated with Inanna and her close counterparts formed a striking cluster. One of the most important discoveries was the temple linked to Inanna. Excavated in the early 20th century, the latest major building phase belongs to the mid-3rd millennium, when Mari was prosperous. The plan was familiar in Mesopotamian terms: an open court leading into a sacred inner room where the divine presence resided. Over time, the complex expanded, adding another inner chamber and more courtyards, with adjacent rooms likely used by temple staff and for storing ritual goods. When the building met its end, it ended violently. Statues were smashed, rooms were ruined, and the destruction looks like the work of soldiers. Mari, for a time, burned. Inside that temple world, statues mattered deeply. Temples were not only homes for gods, they were also spaces where powerful humans tried to remain close to the divine. Kings and high officials placed their own images within sacred courts, as if leaving a permanent representative to stand before the goddess day and night. Wealthy people did the same on a smaller scale, commissioning figures from clay or plaster when stone was too expensive. The goal was not simple vanity. A statue in a holy place was a request that never stopped speaking, a silent appeal for memory, protection, and a favourable destiny. Two figures from Mari became especially famous. One is a king, presented with the formal appearance of sacred leadership. A diadem, carefully arranged hair, and the stylized dignity of ritual presentation. The other is a high-ranking administrator, shown with wide, attentive eyes, as if forever watching the goddess, forever waiting to be heard. Their inscriptions carved on their backs state that these images were dedicated to Inanna man. Even without quoting the ancient words, the meaning is plain. Royal authority and temple devotion were not separate lanes. They ran together. The clothing worn by these figures opens another window into the period. Many statues display a distinctive mantle with a textured, tufted surface, an outfit that looks heavy and ceremonial. It may have originated in skins, with the wool turned outward and shaped into thick tassels. Later, similar garments appear as woven textiles, designed to imitate that earlier look. Whatever the exact material, it became a visual code. Gods wear it, kings wear it, priests and high officials wear it. The garment signals participation in a sacred order that is older than any one city, yet constantly reinvented. Female statues add more mystery. Many depict women wrapped in the same ritual mantle, wearing tall conical hats, sometimes holding a date branch. Some sit on special stools carved with animal legs and hooves, a detail that hints at formal temple roles and an iconography of power. Without inscriptions, certainty vanishes. Are these queens, priestesses, elite patrons, or symbolic figures representing office rather than individuals? The safest answer is that they reflect sacred status. They belong to the temple world, and they show that women were not peripheral to ritual life. They appear as participants and perhaps as leaders, within the visual language of devotion. The temple assemblage also reveals a more colourful side of worship. Strange figures once dismissed as comic characters were later understood as musicians, holding and playing lyres. That matters because Inanna's cult was often connected to performance, music, chant, and dramatic display. The temple was not only a place of silence, it was a stage where sound and rhythm could shape the mood of the gods, soothe them, honour them, and sometimes stir them. Among the most intriguing objects is a small sculpture showing a man and woman seated together on a couch, embracing. Interpreting it is risky. It could be a private dedication by a couple seeking blessing for their union. It could also hint at a more charged ritual idea, a sacred partnership celebrated under the goddess's authority. Inanna's cult in later times is closely connected to themes of sexuality, fertility, and political legitimacy. Even if the exact meaning here cannot be pinned down, the image fits a religious world where intimacy and power were never entirely separate. Mari also contained two closely placed temples, associated with Inanna Zaza and Ishtarat. They stood near a major thoroughfare that linked sacred buildings across the city. Nearby were shrines to other deities, creating a dense temple neighbourhood that must have shaped daily movement, public processions, and the rhythms of festival time. These two temples, like the others, suffered destruction. Heads of statues are often missing, sometimes found far from their bodies, as if the attackers tried to erase identity and presence by breaking faces first. In the temple of Inanna Zaza, inscriptions suggest an unusually bold view of kingship. Royal figures appear styled not merely as rulers, but as beings elevated above ordinary humanity, closer to the divine. titles blur the edge between human office and sacred status. Devotees dedicated their images to Inanna Zaza while describing the king in exalted terms, implying that the goddess's favour and royal authority fed each other. The same religious logic, visible in southern sacred kingship, appears here in a northern accent. A court seal impression linked to a royal spouse offers another perspective. It shows court life filled with music and performance. A high-status woman sits enthroned, holding a date branch, attended by servants. Below, banqueters face one another. Musicians play, dancers clap and move in rhythm. It is a scene of cultivated power where entertainment is not separate from authority. Ceremony, pleasure, and politics interlock. Women's statues in the Zaza and Ishtarat temples resemble those from Inanna man's sanctuary. The tall hat, the ritual mantle, the seated posture on special thrones. Their repetition suggests a recognizable temple identity, perhaps the standard appearance of priestesses in Maori's religious world. One particularly important statue from this temple sphere depicts a gala singer, a temple performer whose role involved lament, chant, and ritual song. The figure wears long hair and displays a striking feature: an animal tail attached at the back. Such elements signal ceremonial identity rather than everyday fashion. Across the ancient Near East, priests sometimes adopted animal symbols to mark ritual power, transformation, or affiliation with the sacred. This statue shows that music was not a decorative extra. It was part of the machinery of ritual. The most startling discovery in the Inanna Zaza temple court was not a human statue at all. It was a tall basalt pillar, carefully placed, rising from the courtyard floor. Its date is debated, and it may be older than the layer in which it was found. The pillar raises a powerful possibility that the goddess could be represented not by an anthropomorphic image, but by a sacred stone. That idea is not strange in ancient religion. A divine image did not always need to resemble a person. The goal was presence, not portraiture. A natural stone could be seen as already filled with the force of the divine because it was shaped by nature rather than crafted by human hands. In some traditions, a stone representation required fewer complicated rites, precisely because it did not carry the same suspicion of human manufacture. A polished pillar could function as a divine body, an anchor for worship, an object toward which offerings, chants, and prayers were directed. This kind of pillar cult is well known in parts of Syria and the wider Levant. It is also remembered in later Mediterranean traditions, where major goddesses could be symbolized by iconic stones. Maori's basalt pillar may fit that older pattern. If so, it suggests that some forms of Inanna worship preserved non-human imagery even as other temples moved toward elaborate statues, precious materials, and highly managed ritual. Daily temple service would have been demanding. Courtyards contained basins for libations. Inner rooms held ritual furniture, including raised platforms that could serve as the deity's bed. The goddess was treated as a living sovereign. Only high-ranking personnel, along with the king, could enter the innermost chamber. Many servants likely lived in adjoining rooms, while others lodged outside, arriving each day to fulfill duties. Clothing and headgear seen in statues may reflect the official appearance of temple women and staff, forming a visible sacred identity recognized throughout the city. A later ritual text from Maori paints a vivid picture of how such ceremonies could unfold. The goddess is prepared for, the temple is cleaned, and the space is arranged like a royal court. Musicians are placed on one side, singers on the other. Women stand in ordered positions. Skilled workers present their tools, turning the temple into a symbolic map of the city's crafts and labour. Offerings are set out. Other divine figures are installed nearby, as if forming a council around the goddess. Then the king arrives, dressed in formal attire, and takes his place in the sacred setting. Laments begin. A seer speaks, a procession enters to the sound of hymns. The atmosphere shifts from solemnity to spectacle. Drums beat. Performers display dangerous skills. Jugglers and sword performers appear. Wrestlers and acrobats enact controlled conflict and physical mastery. Specialized temple women perform their roles in sequence, not as casual entertainment, but as part of a carefully ordered sacred program. Purification follows. Temple sweepers enter. Water is carried in. Sprinkling rites are performed in measured repetitions. The cleansing touches the space, the divine images, and the king himself. Movement through doors is regulated. Even the king must exit by a prescribed route. Libations are poured not only before the goddess, but also in relation to the musicians, as if sound itself is part of the sacred network that must be honoured. Everything in such a ritual is precision. The goal is to avoid offence, to maintain harmony, to draw the goddess into a favourable mood. The performances do more than amuse. They dramatise order, victory, and communal identity. Wrestling may symbolise a cosmic struggle whose outcome must be balanced or guided. The staged triumph of the home side over the symbolic enemy reassures the community that the world remains stable, that danger can be contained, and that the goddess continues to stand with the city. At the southern edge of Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and Tigris finally empty into the Gulf, the city of rose into prominence. This was not a quiet inland settlement. Was a port, and its wealth flowed in from the sea. Ships and caravans moved through the Gulf's island networks, and one island in particular became a key meeting point for merchants arriving with goods from far beyond the river valleys. From there, cargo could be redirected toward Mesopotamia's cities, and sat in the perfect place to profit from it. The rulers of Sumer lived in a land rich in mud brick and grain, but poor in many resources that elites prized most. Good building stone was scarce. Large timber had to be brought in. Metals that defined prestige and power, gold, copper, and tin, were not easily found locally. Even the finest stones used for seals and ornaments arrived from elsewhere. The royal and temple economy depended on distant horizons. Kings celebrated their ability to pull exotic materials into the land and transform them into statues, jewelry, ceremonial vessels, and temple furnishings. Imported beauty was not only luxury, it was proof of reach, influence, and divine favour. Texts from the period speak about faraway regions that were imagined as sources of wonder. Some traditions point toward a flourishing world along the Indus, a place connected to maritime routes and long-distance exchange. Large vessels could move along coastal corridors, linking ports on the Iranian shore, crossing to the lands east of the rivers, and continuing toward the wider Near East. In this chain, the Gulf Islands acted as a staging ground where cargo could be stored, traded, repacked, and sent onward. When those goods finally entered Mesopotamia, benefited first. The port city became a funnel through which prestige flowed north. Ur's main divine patron was the moon god Nana. A major temple complex honoured him, dominating the sacred landscape and anchoring the city's identity. Other gods had shrines as well, but the archaeological record does not offer a clear excavated temple of Inanna at for this early period. Still, devotion does not always leave a single building that can be pointed to with certainty. Inanna's presence in southern religion can appear through objects, symbols, and personal names, even when a dedicated sanctuary remains elusive. The world learned just how wealthy early Ur had been when excavations revealed an enormous cemetery, with graves by the thousand. Most of those burials were simple and practical. Bodies were wrapped in mats or placed in modest coffins. Grave goods, when present, were ordinary. But among the burials, a small number stood apart with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. A cluster of tombs contained gold in astonishing quantities, rare stones, finely crafted instruments, and elaborate furniture. The excavator who brought these graves to light believed the richest of them belonged to the ruling elite, and gave the site a name that has shaped public imagination ever since: the Royal Cemetery. This discovery happened at a time when archaeology captured headlines. The public followed each major find like an adventure story. A few years earlier, the opening of an Egyptian royal tomb had transformed archaeology into global news. When Ur's richest graves emerged, they felt equally dramatic and in some ways even more startling. These burials were far older than the famous Egyptian discoveries. Yet the treasure was just as dazzling. Gold lay scattered across the soil. Beads and pendants still clung to skulls and ribs. Musical instruments and game boards appeared as if a courtly gathering had been frozen in time. One tomb became the emblem of the entire cemetery. In it lay the body of a high-status woman, identified by a cylinder seal found nearby. The seal showed a banquet scene, a visual language of rank and ceremony. The inscription gave a name and title that later readings rendered as Pu Abi, a high lady. Whether that title marked queenship, priestly office, or a status that blended the two is still debated. But the burial itself spoke the language of extreme privilege. The account of her ornaments reads like an inventory of power. A heavy gold band framed the head, layered with wreaths of bright stone beads and gold leaves. Rosettes sparkled across the headdress, carefully made to imitate living flowers. Large, crescent-shaped earrings hung beside the jaw. Necklaces stacked across the chest. Beadwork formed curtains of colour across the upper body, likely sewn onto a garment that would have moved with a faint clicking sound. Rings covered the fingers. Pins secured clothing. Amulets shaped like animals lay near the arms. Seals rested among the jewellery, as if identity itself had been placed under protection. The chamber also held other bodies. A woman lay nearby, another at the foot of the bier, and a man was positioned opposite, accompanied by a belt and tools that suggested a formal role. Around them were bowls, cups, vessels, and objects of precious metal and imported stone. The arrangement did not look like a simple household burial. It looked staged, crowded, and intensely ceremonial. Above the chamber, a large open space was cut into the ground, connected by a sloping entry. This upper area contained more bodies, more objects, and the remains of a vehicle drawn by animals. The equipment was richly decorated, including animal-headed fittings in gold and inlaid materials. Nearby lay an enormous wooden chest, now empty, once likely filled with textiles. Harps and lyres appeared among clusters of bodies, along with drinking implements and carved boards for play. The impression is not of austerity, but of a courtly world brought into the grave. From the beginning, the most unsettling question was the human bodies found outside the main chambers. Were these attendants sacrificed to accompany a ruler into the afterlife, or were they something else? One early interpretation argued that the scene represented a single, monumental funeral. In that view, servants, soldiers, drivers, grooms, and musicians entered the pit in formal order, took their places and died together as part of the rite. Cups placed near many of the dead were used to suggest poison. The careful positioning of bodies seemed to show that the palace hierarchy had been preserved even in death. Guards at one end, vehicle crews near the animals, musicians beside instruments, and court women near the central figure. This interpretation became famous because it created a vivid narrative. It turned archaeology into a story with characters and choreography. Yet it also raised immediate problems. Mesopotamian texts do not clearly describe mass funerary sacrifice on this scale. If the practice were common, it is strange that administrative records and temple archives remained so quiet. That silence opened the door to alternative explanations. Some researchers began to suspect that the richest burials might not be straightforward royal graves. Titles can be slippery. Objects can travel as gifts or heirlooms. A name engraved on a bowl does not automatically prove the person buried with it was the owner. Cylinder seals, especially, could move from hand to hand. They were precious, portable, and sometimes passed down through families. Because of this, identifications based only on inscriptions found inside a tomb can be questioned. Another line of interpretation shifted the focus toward temple life. Ur's religious world was dominated by Inanna, and temple institutions could command wealth, labour, and prestige. Some suggested that at least part of the cemetery could reflect a sacred elite rather than a purely political one. Priestesses, priests, and high officials whose status was expressed through spectacle. The high number of women in the richest burials fueled this discussion. Were these queens of a dynasty or women with powerful religious roles? Were the ornaments marks of court fashion or symbols linked to divine myth and temple ritual? Then came a more radical challenge. Perhaps the mass pits were not the result of a single event at all. In some regions of Mesopotamia, burials were reused. Tombs were reopened. Older bones were moved aside to make room for new bodies. Skulls could be gathered and deposited separately. Long bones could be rearranged. Offerings could accumulate over time, representing not one household, but multiple generations, multiple rites, and repeated visits. In this model, what looks like a single dramatic sacrifice might actually be the archaeological footprint of many episodes of burial and reburial. Supporters of this view pointed to parallels in other cemeteries of the same era, where tombs show both intact individual burials and mixed deposits of bones. In those places, there is no need to imagine mass killing to explain skull clusters and jumbled remains. Reuse and rearrangement can produce similar patterns. A tomb chamber can be opened from above, a body removed, and objects left behind. A pit can contain bones from earlier interments gathered during later rituals. What appears to be one final ceremony might instead be the last moment in a long sequence. Even so, not everyone is persuaded. Later, scientific work added new fuel to the argument. Scans of certain skulls suggested blunt or sharp force trauma, implying violent death rather than poisoning. This revived the possibility of deliberate killing, though it still leaves open how, when, and why it happened. If deaths were forced, were they an organized ritual act, a display of power, or something closer to coercion and control? If deaths were not simultaneous, could injuries reflect conflict, later, disturbance, or even post-burial damage? The evidence can be read in more than one direction, and modern certainty is limited by the way early excavations handled human remains. Only a small fraction of bodies were preserved for later study. Much of what could have settled the debate was never kept in a form that forensic science could fully exploit. There are also cultural questions that complicate the famous story of willing attendants. Mesopotamian beliefs about the underworld were often grim. The dead were imagined in a shadowy realm where comfort depended on offerings from the living. Without proper care, the dead could suffer hunger and neglect. In that worldview, volunteering for death to follow a master is not an obvious choice. It is possible, of course, that honour, fear, and obligation could override dread. But the idea of a cheerful collective march into death sits uneasily beside the darker tone of many Mesopotamian afterlife traditions. A simpler point is also important. Cups placed near the mouth are common in Mesopotamian burial custom. A cup does not automatically mean poison. It can be part of standard funerary equipment, a symbol of provision for the journey, or a ritual object connected to offerings. The presence of music and games in the graves can be interpreted as courtly continuity, but it can also be read as symbolic provisioning, giving the dead what they might need in the next world, or what the living imagined they should possess. What remains beyond dispute is the extraordinary scale of wealth on display. Whoever these people were, the burials were meant to project prestige. Gold and imported stone were not merely personal adornment. They were statements. They showed access to the long-distance networks that fed Ur's power. They demonstrated the ability to command craft specialists. They turned death into theatre. The key question is identity. Were these kings and queens, in the political sense, founders of a ruling house? Were they sacred figures whose authority drew from the temple as much as from the palace? Were they members of a charismatic elite whose followers were buried nearby as clients, dependents, or participants in repeated rituals? The cemetery does not give a single answer that ends the discussion, and there is one more thread running quietly beneath the gold and the bones. Many of the objects found in these graves echo motifs that later appear in the mythology and symbolism of Inanna. That does not prove the cemetery was hers, or that every burial was tied to her cult. But it suggests that the elite language of power in early Mesopotamia was never only economic or political. It was also mythic. Jewelry, animals, rosettes, feasting scenes, and ceremonial display could belong to a world where divine stories shaped how status was imagined and performed. The graves at raise a question that has never truly been settled. Who were the people buried in these astonishingly rich tombs? Were they rulers of a dynasty, kings and queens laid to rest in splendour? Or were they figures of sacred authority, priests and priestesses whose power was bound to the temple rather than the throne? The earliest excavator of the site believed the answer was obvious. Only rulers, he argued, would be honoured with such wealth and accompanied in death by attendants. The presence of multiple bodies in and around certain tombs seemed to confirm this interpretation. If a burial lacked such attendants, it could not belong to a sovereign. That reasoning shaped the identity of the cemetery for generations. Yet the graves themselves are strangely quiet about rank. The inscriptions that survive are few. A handful of names appear on bowls or cylinder seals. 3 names match those known from later king lists. But one of the most famous individuals from the cemetery, the richly adorned woman known as Pu-Abi, does not appear in those lists. Her name does not echo through other inscriptions from the period. If she was a queen, she left little trace outside her tomb. Her attire invites a different interpretation. The layered beadwork, the complex diadem, the abundance of gold ornaments, the ritual quality of her regalia, all suggest a ceremonial identity. The ensemble looks less like military authority and more like sacred display. It is possible that her position was religious, rather than political. Her seal names her as Nin. That title is crucial. Nin can mean lady, but it can also designate a high-ranking religious office. In certain contexts, a Nin stood alongside an unpriest in a sacred residence attached to the temple. If Pu-Abi held such a title, she may have participated in ritual acts of great significance. The role of Nin was not merely decorative. It could represent the highest female function within a temple hierarchy. Other seals found in the cemetery reinforce this possibility. Several, carry inscriptions mentioning En or Nin. One shows a seated goddess flanked by geese beneath a crescent moon, imagery heavy with divine symbolism. Other seals refer to scribes of a Nin or to women described as sacred ladies of particular gods. These objects do not clearly proclaim queenship. They speak the language of temple administration and cultic identity. The title Nin was sometimes borne by royal women in later periods, yet it also appears in contexts tied firmly to priestly office. In certain traditions, there could only be one Nin attached to a temple at a time, much like the singular En priestess, who represented the highest sacred authority. This overlap between royal and sacred terminology makes identification difficult. Titles alone cannot settle the matter. One seal found near a richly adorned body carries the name Dumu Kisal, meaning child of the temple court. Whether this was a personal name or a role, it evokes a temple environment. The imagery carved on the seal shows banquet scenes, musicians, dancers, and figures drinking through straws from large vessels. Below, a festive procession unfolds. Such scenes are often interpreted as celebrations linked to seasonal cycles and agricultural renewal. The temple was not merely a place of solemn ritual, it was also a centre of festival life. The cylinder seals themselves seem unusually pristine. They were crafted from precious stones such as lapis lazuli and appear scarcely used for administrative sealing. This suggests a function beyond bureaucracy. Cylinder seals could serve as amulets. They were believed to carry protective or beneficial properties, and their continuous rolling design allowed imagery to repeat endlessly. The act of rolling the seal across clay may have been thought to transfer power. Banquet scenes and fertility motifs carved into these stones could have invoked divine favour rather than authenticated contracts. The iconography of these seals also divides along gendered lines. Women's seals often show feasting and celebration, while seals associated with royal servants display combat between animals. This distinction hints at different symbolic worlds. The women buried at Ur may have been guardians of ritual abundance rather than figures of dynastic warfare. A vehicle discovered in one of the richest tombs complicates the picture further. It has often been described as a chariot, yet its form resembles a ceremonial, carrying sledge. High-ranking religious figures are known to have possessed such conveyances, along with thrones and sceptres. In agricultural rites, sledges were used in threshing, drawn across fields to separate grain from chaff. Some ancient images show women riding on such sledges during fertility ceremonies, perhaps symbolically blessing the harvest. It is tempting to imagine that the vehicle in Pu-Abi's tomb once served a similar ritual function. Across the cemetery, bulls appear again and again. Lyres shaped with bull heads, sculptures of rams standing against stylized trees, and decorative motifs featuring horned animals dominate the artistic landscape. The bull was a sacred symbol associated with divine power and especially linked to the moon god Nana, patron deity of Ur. Bull imagery on musical instruments suggests a ritual context. Music and sacred animals belong to the temple world. One of the most famous finds is a lyre crowned with a bull's head of gold and lapis. Its decorative panel shows scenes that may relate to funerary ritual or mythic narrative. The instrument was discovered near clustered bodies, and early reports described skeletal fingers resting on its strings. Whether arranged deliberately or preserved by chance, the scene creates a powerful image of music at the threshold of death. Elsewhere in the cemetery, rosettes appear everywhere. They decorate diadems, gaming boards, combs, jewellery, and relief panels. The 8-petaled rosette is strongly associated with Inanna in later iconography. It may have symbolized vitality, beauty, or celestial power. On several objects, goats or rams stand beside stylized trees, heavy with fruit. The imagery evokes fertility, seasonal renewal, and the abundance of crops. Some diadems show animals reclining on either side of what appears to be a flowering branch. Scholars have suggested that these branches may represent male and female date palm inflorescences, symbols of pollination. Artificial pollination was practiced in ancient Mesopotamia, and the union of male and female elements in the orchard was essential for fruit production. The symbolism of paired animals and flowering branches could therefore reflect sacred metaphors of union and fertility. Dates and apples were deeply charged symbols in ancient poetry. Love songs celebrate orchards heavy with fruit and compare beloved figures to flourishing trees. If such imagery is echoed in the grave goods of it may point toward a cult of divine union and agricultural renewal, rather than simple royal luxury. Gaming boards found in the tombs also carry rosette motifs. These boards, among the earliest known examples, may have served not only for entertainment, but for divination. In some traditions, lots were cast to determine divine will, including the appointment of priestesses. If gaming boards at had ritual functions, their presence in the graves strengthens the connection to temple activity. Even martial imagery found in certain reliefs blends into sacred symbolism. Lions stride calmly over subdued figures, and rosettes decorate wheel hubs and metal fittings. Lions were closely associated with Inanna, often depicted standing upon them. The combination of lions and rosettes suggests a divine presence woven into decorative art. A seal discovered in the cemetery bears the name of a king of another city and describes him as husband of the new gig, a title connected with a sacred woman. The inscription includes a rosette and a crescent moon. The symbolism unites royal identity with divine marriage. In Mesopotamian tradition, rulers could present themselves as spouses of a goddess, reinforcing legitimacy through sacred union. The golden helmet attributed to Mesgalamdug also appears more ceremonial than martial. Its delicate construction suggests ritual display rather than battlefield protection. It resembles the headgear of a high priest, complete with stylized hair and diadem. If so, the boundary between king and priest becomes blurred. Some researchers have proposed that the cemetery lay near a temple complex, perhaps even adjacent to a sanctuary dedicated to Inanna. Layers of debris beneath the graves contain seal impressions, tablets, miniature vessels, figurines, and fragments of large sculptures. Such material resembles the waste deposits of temple households that managed goods and storage. The proximity of monumental architecture suggests that the cemetery was not isolated, but connected to an administrative and sacred centre. Texts from mention temples of Nana and other deities, and it is possible that additional sacred buildings once stood nearby. Burial close to a temple would have placed the dead within a sphere of divine protection. Temples were believed to radiate a sacred aura. Those permitted to rest near them may have held special status during life, yet certainty remains elusive. Fertility symbolism in the graves does not belong exclusively to Inanna. Other goddesses, including birth and mother figures, shared similar imagery. The moon, God's consort, and other female deities were also praised in love poetry and agricultural hymns. The symbols found in the tombs may reflect a broader religious landscape rather than a single cult. What can be said with confidence is that the graves at are saturated with imagery of abundance, renewal, and sacred celebration. Banquet scenes, musical instruments, flowering trees, bulls, lions, rosettes, and richly adorned women form a visual vocabulary of fertility and divine favour. If many of those buried were connected to temple service, their interment near a sacred precinct would make sense. High-ranking priestesses often had no direct heirs responsible for tending their graves, and a communal burial ground associated with the temple would have ensured ongoing ritual care. Whether kings, queens, priests, or priestesses, the individuals in these tombs were people of extraordinary standing. Their burial was designed as spectacle. Gold flashed beneath the earth. Music and feasting were carved into stone. Symbols of growth and celestial power surrounded the dead. Inanna herself embodied paradox. She ruled over love and fertility, yet she also descended into the underworld. Her power flowed from both life and death. The objects placed in the graves of may reflect that duality. The dead were adorned with emblems of renewal, perhaps in hope that the same divine force governing the growth of crops would also guide them through the darkness beyond life. In the earliest centuries of Mesopotamian history, the goddess Inanna often feels like a presence seen through fog. Her name appears, her symbols flash in art, her influence is hinted at in ritual and song. Yet, a complete portrait remains hard to grasp. Then, toward the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, something changes. Inanna steps forward in a sharper outline, no longer a local figure whose meaning shifts from city to city, but a force with empire-wide weight. Under the rulers of Akkad, she becomes the kind of deity an expanding state cannot do without. A patron of authority, conquest, and political destiny. To understand why this transformation mattered, it helps to picture Sumer as it once was. Not a single kingdom, but a mosaic of city-states. Each city had walls, temples, canals, workshops, storehouses, and its own patron god. Politics and religion were not separate arenas. When cities fought, rulers described the conflict as something larger than armies and boundaries. Victories were framed as the triumph of one city's divine protector over another's. Defeated enemies were not only beaten on the battlefield, they were symbolically overcome in the cosmic order. These rivalries were carved into stone. Large monuments proclaimed conquest, showing rulers guided by divine power, crushing foes who stood for a competing city and a competing god. The message was never subtle. The god chose the king obeyed the god, and the enemy's fall proved the enemy's god had been humbled. Across time, the gods of the south were also organized into something like an extended family. At the top stood Enlil, the dominant figure of the pantheon, whose sacred center lay at Nippur. Other great deities were fitted into this hierarchy. Enki, once central in older traditions, could be described in later thinking as subordinate to Enlil. Inanna herself could appear in texts as Enlil's daughter, even when other traditions placed her elsewhere. Nanna, the moon god of also comes to be linked into this Enlil-centered order. Strangely, the supreme god's own image remains elusive. Enlil is everywhere in authority, yet almost nowhere in clear visual form. If his likeness existed, it may have blended into the countless anonymous divine figures carved into seals, figures that look powerful but refuse to reveal their names. Nippur's position was unique. It was not a prize city in the usual sense. There was no celebrated dynasty of Nippur pushing outward with armies. In the surviving memory of the age, Nippur stands apart as a sacred hinge point. Even the greatest rulers were expected to bow before its authority. The tradition that later tells of a mighty Akkadian king consulting the will of Enlil captures this mood. The emperor may dominate cities, but the god's sanctuary remains a place where pride is dangerous. And danger in these traditions is never merely personal. When divine favor falters, the consequences are portrayed as civilizational. A king might interpret silence from the gods as an insult, and in some stories that insult becomes a turning point. A temple is violated, a boundary is crossed, and the punishment arrives not as a simple defeat, but as systemic collapse. Pressure was building everywhere by the late 3rd millennium. The southern cities depended on irrigation and predictable river flow. The Euphrates and the Tigris sustained life, but the landscape was fragile. A shift in river channels could transform fortune overnight. A city that thrived on water access could weaken if the current moved away, while another settlement might suddenly find itself favoured. Prosperity was never guaranteed, and competition for land and water sharpened rivalries. In the north, the pattern was different. Rainfall allowed farming without the same dependence on canals. Grain could be stored at scale, then shipped south by river. This created a flow of resources that tied regions together. Northern communities did not exist outside Sumer's influence. Cultural exchange had deep roots, visible in artifacts that imitate southern styles. River traffic, especially along the Euphrates, acted as a corridor linking different worlds. Trade networks extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Materials that the southern plain lacked became the obsession of elites: metals, stone, timber, rare pigments, and precious stones. Caravans and ships connected distant regions in a web of exchange. Cornelian and lapis lazuli travelled long routes. Tin, essential for bronze, arrived through complex supply chains reaching into Central Asia. The Persian Gulf functioned as a highway to ports and islands that acted as staging points. Egypt's gold added another magnet, pulling traders across wide distances. These were not casual contacts. They formed an economic bloodstream that fed city growth, temple wealth, and royal ambition. Then came a period of strain. Economic stagnation appears in the record as a slowing of stability, perhaps worsened by climate fluctuations and drought. When systems are stretched thin, wars between city-states become wars of exhaustion. This is the environment in which a new power rises from the north: Akkad. A leader named Sargon becomes the figure around whom later memory builds an empire's origin story. His world is Akkadian-speaking, East Semitic, culturally distinct from Sumer, and hungry for expansion. The city that becomes the empire's capital, Akkad itself, is famous and yet still missing from the ground. It remains one of the great absences of archaeology, a place known by texts and tradition, but not securely located. Sargon's ascent is remembered through legend as much as through history. His name carries the sound of legitimacy, the claim of rightful rule. But such claims often appear when legitimacy is disputed. Later lists describe humble origins, even calling his father a gardener. Other stories add the dramatic twist: a mother who is a high priestess, a forbidden birth, a baby hidden in a basket sealed with bitumen and sent downriver. The motif echoes a wider ancient pattern: the future ruler, rescued from water, raised by someone ordinary, then lifted by divine favour into kingship. This story is not only about origins, it is about divine selection. The river becomes fate, and the goddess becomes the force guiding the chosen child. In narratives about Sargon's early career, the goddess appears not as distant theology, but as a decisive actor. Dreams are used as warnings. A king is terrified by a vision in which a towering woman drenches him in violence. Fear leads to plots. Plots lead to attempted murder. The would-be victim survives, not through luck, but because the goddess stands at his side, blocking the trap. Even the political detail of a death order delivered in writing becomes a dramatic device. A messenger unknowingly carrying his own execution. Ancient storytelling loves this cruel mechanism. It appears in different cultures because it captures a universal tension. the vulnerability of the powerless to the hidden message of power. Behind the drama, a historical outline is visible. Sargon defeats established rulers and folds the southern cities into a new structure. This is no longer a loose collection of rivals. It becomes something closer to a centralized empire, the kind that claims to span horizons and seas. Inscriptions later boast of reaching distant coasts, of controlling regions from the upper sea to the lower sea, from sunrise to sunset. Some of these claims are political poetry, meant to impress. Yet the reach of Akkadian influence is not imaginary. Objects with Akkadian style and names appear far from the core, showing that this empire, at minimum, projected prestige and connections across great distances. In the north, a remarkable artifact is said to preserve the face of this new royal world, a copper head found in a temple of the goddess. Whether it depicts Sargon or a successor, the point is clear. The metal portrait is not simply art. It is a political statement cast in a material valuable enough to be melted down. Its survival suggests reverence, fear, or both. The ruler is shown with controlled features, formal hair, and a style that signals authority. The king is being presented as more than a man. He is presented as an institution. Akkad also reorganizes power. The older Sumerian pattern tied rulers closely to temple structures. Akkadian kings increasingly operate from palatial complexes, great houses, administrative engines that manage quotas, labor, standardized measures, and extraction of resources. The empire's center becomes a place where wealth accumulates and decisions radiate outward. This bureaucracy, expanding under later kings, creates the conditions for an imperial religion. This is where Inanna's transformation becomes unmistakable. For Sargon and his successors, Inanna is not only a goddess of love and fertility, she becomes a patron of conquest. Her Akkadian name, Ishtar, carries its own layered history. The origins of the name remain debated and unclear, but what matters for the imperial story is how fully Ishtar and Inanna merge into a single powerful figure in the imagination of statecraft. She is invoked as a personal protector. She is celebrated as the force that breaks enemies and grants legitimacy. Her iconography changes accordingly. The gentle symbols of abundance recede. Weapons rise from her shoulders. She holds blades and clubs. A lion becomes her permanent companion, not merely near her, but under her control, the way an empire imagines its own dominance over the world. When she is shown enthroned, her posture is direct, often confronting the viewer, while worshippers remain in profile, heads lowered. The imagery is designed to declare that she is not a background divinity. She is the center. A later Akkadian king, Naram-Sin, pushes this religious politics even further. He favors a form of Ishtar associated with warfare, a name that in later tradition becomes a distinct figure. The important point is not the label, but the strategy. The king binds his success to a war goddess so tightly that military victory becomes proof of divine marriage, divine endorsement, and eventually divinity itself. Naram-Sin does something extraordinary for Mesopotamia. He claims godhood in a formal way. His name is marked as divine in writing. He calls himself the god of his own city. In a world where kings already styled themselves as chosen by gods, as children of gods, or as spouses of goddesses, this step is radical, but not insane. It is the logical extreme of a system where political power requires sacred sanction. An empire made of many peoples needs a legitimacy that can reach across language and local tradition. Declaring the king divine is a brutal solution to the problem of acceptance. Visual culture reinforces this. Victory stelae show the king climbing a mountain, trampling enemies, larger than his soldiers, wearing the horned crown associated with divinity. The sky itself acknowledges him, with star signs above. The narrative is straightforward. The king stands closer to the cosmic order than ordinary humans do. Religion is also used as governance. Akkadian rulers appoint their daughters into high priestly positions in major temples. This is not merely devotion, it is a political instrument. Installing royal women into sacred offices anchors imperial power inside local religious systems. The title Enanna becomes a bridge between cultures, a respected Sumerian term maintained in the south, even when the family that holds the office is Akkadian. Through these appointments, the palace enters the temple not as an outsider, but as the keeper of ritual legitimacy. Evidence for such appointments survives in objects dedicated by temple officials and in the names of priestesses tied to major gods. These women appear seated with footstools, attended by servants, portrayed with the visual language of high ritual rank. The inscriptions emphasize lineage and authority. Daughter of the king, priestess of a great god. The message again is political. The empire has not only conquered land, it has entered the divine household. At the same time, the art of Ishtar grows more imperial in tone. She is not only a recipient of offerings. She is depicted restraining enemies, holding ropes that lead to captive figures. The goddess becomes the embodiment of forced order. The king's enemies are her enemies. Her dominance justifies his campaigns, and his campaigns demonstrate her power. Yet empires break the same way river systems do. Gradually, then suddenly. Akkad's reach creates its own vulnerabilities. Conquered cities resent outsiders placed over them. Tributary demands grow heavier. Campaigns require resources, which require more extraction, which breeds more resistance. External enemies also learn to coordinate against a central power. Add environmental stress and shifting settlement patterns, and a state that once looked unstoppable begins to fracture. Later tradition portrays this collapse as a moral drama. A grand lament tells of a golden age when Akkad overflowed with wealth, animals from distant lands, metals, stones, and grain, a city so prosperous it seemed blessed beyond measure. In this narrative, Inanna is the engine of abundance. Vigilant, restless, filling storehouses, making the land flourish, drawing exotic goods and foreign trade as if the world itself were flowing toward her throne. Then the favour withdraws. The same tradition blames sacrilege and arrogance. A king seeks permission from the high god and receives no sign. He waits, mourns, strips himself of grandeur, and still the silence remains. Finally, he chooses defiance. He attacks what should never be attacked. The temple is treated like a quarry. Sacred doors are violated. Treasures are taken. The image is not just destruction, but inversion. Order becomes theft. Worship becomes plunder. Intelligence drains away as cargo leaves the docks. Punishment arrives in the form ancient audiences stop producing syrup and wine. Clouds stop producing syrup and wine. Clouds refuse rain. Hunger erases dignity. Even the dead are not properly buried. The language is meant to feel like the world unmaking itself. The curse expands into a terrifying list of reversals. Family bonds break. Taboo acts become normal. Roofs are scraped for something edible. Weeds claim the city. The final threat is absolute. The capital will disappear so completely that it will not rise again. In the aftermath, the story's final twist is political. Inanna, once the goddess who favoured Akkad, is praised for its destruction because her allegiance returns to older centres that resisted imperial domination. The narrative legitimizes the new order by presenting Akkad's fall as divine justice rather than human failure. It is an explanation that turns history into theology. And there is one last detail that makes the legend linger. The city itself vanishes. Akkad becomes a name without a map. The capital of a world-changing empire slips out of sight, leaving archaeologists and historians with a haunting absence. A city that claimed everything ends as something that cannot be found. During the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the goddess Inanna remains both present and elusive. Her name appears in temple ruins at Uruk, Mari, and Nippur. Her symbols emerge from graves in the royal cemetery of Kings invoke her in inscriptions. Yet written records from this early period are sparse, and her personality is still forming in the historical imagination. One extraordinary exception stands apart from the fragmentary silence of the age. 3 powerful hymns composed by Enheduana, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and high priestess in the city of These compositions, addressed to Inanna, represent the earliest known body of literature attributed to a named individual. If the attribution is accepted, Enheduana becomes the first identifiable author in recorded history. Sargon had appointed his daughter as priestess of the moon, god Nana, at Tradition credits her with numerous temple hymns across Mesopotamia, though later editorial layers complicate that claim. Yet the 3 great hymns devoted to Inanna possess an intensity of voice that feels singular and personal. Their language burns with urgency, political tension, and emotional vulnerability. They read not as ceremonial formula, but as lived experience transformed into sacred poetry. This devotion is striking because Enheduana served officially as priestess of Nana, not Inanna. Her sacred role bound her to the lunar deity of Yet her loyalties aligned elsewhere. The Akkadian kings had forged a special bond, with Inanna identifying her as the divine patron of imperial power. In the volatile political climate of southern Mesopotamia, allegiance to Inanna carried political meaning. The southern city-states resisted Akkadian control. Enheduana's appointment symbolized imperial dominance, and hostility toward her position was inevitable. The tension between Akkad and the Sumerian cities unfolds in her hymns, as a struggle not merely between rulers, but between gods. Inanna stands as champion of imperial authority. Nana represents the established order of Through poetic imagination, political rebellion becomes cosmic conflict. Enheduana composed in Sumerian, even though Akkadian was likely her spoken language. This choice was deliberate. By invoking Inanna in her Sumerian name rather than the Semitic Ishtar, she cloaked imperial ideology in traditional southern vocabulary. At times, she calls the goddess Inin, an older name that merges local tradition with evolving theology. Language becomes strategy. Poetry becomes diplomacy. The first of the great hymns describes Inanna's assault on the mountain of Ebi, located in the northeast, near the ridge now known as Jebel Hamrin, symbolizes more than geography. It stands for the rebellious highland peoples who refused submission. In the poem, the mountain is personified as defiant and arrogant. It does not bow. It does not lower itself before the goddess. Its pride demands punishment. In this narrative, Inanna embodies imperial force. She is no longer merely a goddess of fertility and celestial beauty. She appears armoured, radiant as the morning star, carrying weapons soaked in blood. She strides across battlefields, splits shields, summons storm and flood. She roars like a lion and charges like a wild bull. Terror crowns her brow. Rosettes of precious stone hang at her throat. The 7-headed weapon gleams in her hand. The poem does not conceal its message. Resistance to Akkad is resistance to Inanna. Submission is survival. Inanna appeals first to An, the ancient sky god. and attempts restraint. He describes AB as lush, fertile, abundant with animals and fruit. The mountain is painted as paradise before devastation, a literary technique that heightens the horror to come. The calm of An contrasts with Inanna's storming fury. He represents an older divine order. She represents a new generation rising to dominance. Unmoved by caution, Inanna unleashes catastrophe. She opens her arsenal, summons wind and fire, splits rock with her blade. Forests burn, rivers dry, serpents writhe from shattered stone. The mountain trembles as cliffs collapse. Smoke veils the sky. Inanna ascends the ruined heights and proclaims her triumph, declaring that pride without reverence leads only to annihilation. The imagery is vivid, brutal, unapologetic. It mirrors the relentless campaigns of the Akkadian dynasty. Warfare becomes sacred theatre. Victory becomes divine inevitability. The second hymn, often known as Mistress of Countless Powers, moves from external conquest to internal crisis. The struggle now centres on itself. A local ruler named Lugal-Ain rises to power with the backing of the priesthood of Nana. Enheduana refuses to legitimize him. Her refusal costs her position. She is expelled from the temple complex and driven from her residence. Her hymn becomes both prayer and protest. She presents her exile not merely as personal injustice, but as a violation of divine order. In her view, Inanna holds authority over the appointment of sacred rulers. Lugal-Anin's elevation bypasses that authority. The conflict between priestess and usurper is elevated to cosmic dispute. Enheduana addresses Inanna with desperate intensity. She describes the goddess as mistress of the ME, the fundamental principles that structure existence itself. The ME are not easily translated. They represent the divine patterns that govern kingship, speech, sexuality, wealth, destruction, renewal, judgment, chaos, and stability. They are the architecture of reality. According to myth, these powers once belonged to Enki but were claimed by Inanna. In this hymn, she holds them firmly. She gathers them, clasps them to her chest, wields them like weapons. Authority over the ME means authority over destiny. The hymn catalogues these powers in long, incantatory sequences. To build and to destroy. To transform man into woman and woman into man. To grant wealth and to withdraw it. To inspire desire and to incite conflict. To create fear and to grant mercy. To establish kingship and to dismantle it. The list flows without hierarchy. Order and disorder coexist within the goddess's domain. This sweeping enumeration reflects a worldview in which divine force contains contradiction. Creation and annihilation are two aspects of one authority. Nothing lies outside her jurisdiction. In exile, Enheduana's voice shifts between lament and invocation. She describes approaching light only to be scorched by it. She speaks of bitterness replacing sweetness, of abandonment by the moon god. Yet she never openly condemns Nana. Instead, she appeals to higher arbitration, urging Inanna to assert her supremacy. Her words crescendo into repetition. It must be known. It must be known. The insistence becomes incantation. The goddess must be recognized as supreme over heaven and earth. Her verdict cannot be reversed. Once she declares destruction, destruction follows. Once she grants approval, no force can undo it. The hymn concludes with reconciliation. Inanna's fury subsides. She resumes her celestial radiance. The moon god gazes upon her. Harmony is restored in heaven, mirroring the restoration of order on earth. The implication is clear. Imperial authority stands reaffirmed. The third hymn, often rendered as Mistress of a Vast Heart, amplifies Inanna's cosmic dominance. She surpasses even the high gods in decisive power, and does not act without her. Enlil does not decree destiny without her. Her word binds heaven and earth. The tone is relentless. She's compared to storms, floods, predators. Her weapons drip with blood. Her rage darkens daylight. Cities crumble at her glance. Even the great gods tremble. Yet she is also described as radiant, resplendent, sovereign in beauty. Again, the ME are invoked in extended litany. Human behaviours, social roles, political authority, joy, grief, deceit, truth, prosperity, calamity, kingship, ritual, violence, compassion. All belong to her sphere. The list resists tidy explanation because it reflects a worldview where divinity permeates every aspect of existence. Enheduana identifies herself openly near the end. She declares her office, her devotion, her suffering. Her personal crisis becomes inseparable from the fate of empire. In praising Inanna, she defends Akkad. In defending Akkad, she secures her own restoration. These hymns endured for centuries in scribal schools. Students copied them long after the political context had faded. Their survival testifies to their literary power. The voice of Enheduana carries across millennia not only as religious devotion, but as political theology, as personal lament, and as cultural memory. Through these compositions, Inanna emerges fully formed as warrior, judge, patron of kingship, mistress of cosmic order, and force of unstoppable transformation. The goddess, who once flickered in fragmentary traces, now stands in unmistakable clarity. The name of Enheduana did not fade with the fall of the Akkadian Empire. For centuries after her lifetime, her compositions were copied and recopied in scribal schools. Young students pressed her hymns into clay, line after line, preserving the voice of a woman who had lived more than 4,000 years earlier. Even today, her words still carry an unmistakable emotional force. They are not dry ritual formulas. They tremble with devotion, fear, political urgency, and personal resolve. Yet for a long time, Enheduana herself remained almost invisible. Her poetry survived, but her appearance and daily life seemed lost to history. As high priestess of the moon, god Nana in the city of Ur, she would have resided in the sacred complex attached to the great temple. Her world was likely structured by ceremony, administration, and strict ritual observance. The office of empriestess required separation from ordinary life. It was a position of immense prestige, but also one of confinement. In the 1920s, excavations at Ur brought an unexpected revelation. Alongside the famous royal tombs, archaeologists uncovered the remains of the Djipar, the official residence of the high priestess within the temple precinct of Nana. The structure exposed belongs to a later rebuilding, dating to the 2nd millennium. Whether Enheduana herself lived in that particular building cannot be proven, yet it stood on the same sacred ground where earlier priestesses had once served. In 1927, within debris from this sacred residence, fragments of a broken limestone disc came to light. The pieces had been scattered and damaged, as though intentionally smashed and trampled into the earth. When carefully reassembled, they revealed a carved scene of remarkable importance. The relief shows a ritual moment. At the front stands a nude temple official, pouring a libation from a spouted vessel over a ceremonial stand decorated with a flowering plant. Behind him stand 3 figures. The central figure, clearly dominant in scale and placement, is a woman dressed in the distinctive flounced Kaunikese garment associated with high ritual status. Her posture is formal and composed. She raises her hand to her face in a gesture of reverence, touching her nose in a sign of respect. Her long hair falls over her shoulders in loose curls, and she wears a tall conical headdress with a rolled brim. Later, restoration altered some details of the disc, flattening the headdress and reshaping architectural elements in the background. What appears today as a stepped tower may not have originally been intended as such. More likely, the figures stand before a temple facade, rather than a towering structure. Despite these restoration issues, the identity of the central woman is confirmed by an inscription carved on the reverse. Though the text was damaged, scholars were able to reconstruct its meaning. It names Enheduana, describing her as the true woman of Nana and the spouse of Nana, and identifying her as the daughter of Sargon, king of Kish. It records that she dedicated a ritual table within the temple of Inanna in Ur, and named it the Table of Heaven. This inscription is extraordinary. It reveals how Enheduana understood her own position. By calling herself the true woman of Nana, she aligned herself symbolically with Ningal, the divine consort of the moon god. As priestess, she did not merely serve Nana, she embodied his earthly spouse. The title underscores the sacred marriage ideology embedded within Mesopotamian kingship and temple structure. Yet the dedication described on the disc was not made to Nana's temple, but to the temple of Inanna. This detail is striking. Enheduana held office in service of the moon god, yet her literary and political loyalties were powerfully drawn toward Inanna. Her father Sargon and her nephew Naram-Sin had both elevated Inanna as a patron of imperial authority. The disc quietly acknowledges this tension. Enheduana stood at the intersection of two powerful cults, balancing devotion to Nana with allegiance to Inanna. Her position was not merely ceremonial. Seal impressions discovered in Ur show that she presided over an administrative household. One seal names a superintendent who served her. Another names a scribe who identified himself as her servant. A third inscription refers to an individual described as her son. The word son raises questions. High priestesses were not supposed to bear children. The term may have been metaphorical, expressing loyalty rather than biological descent. Yet ancient Mesopotamian tradition includes stories of kings claiming descent from priestesses. Sargon himself was said in legend to have been born of a high priestess. Later, rulers also boasted of similar origins. The symbolic power of priestly motherhood could not be entirely dismissed. Another seal bearing Enheduana's name identifies her explicitly as child of Sargon and confirms the presence of scribal personnel attached to her service. These small clay impressions offer rare glimpses into the daily structure of her office. The young priestess was not an isolated mystic. She commanded staff, managed resources, and stood at the center of an institutional network. To understand her role more clearly, it is necessary to consider the older institution of the Ennead. In early Sumerian cities, the title En referred to a sacred ruler who functioned as consort of a goddess. In Uruk, the male En was closely associated with Inanna. When Sargon introduced the broader title of king, placing himself above local rulers, the traditional authority of the En was reduced in political scope. Yet the sacred dimension remained. The En priestess may have developed as the female counterpart to this earlier office. Like the male En, she was designated as the chosen spouse of a deity. There could be only one En priestess for a given god at any time, and she was appointed for life. Divination rituals determined her selection, though royal influence undoubtedly shaped the outcome. From Sargon's era onward, daughters of reigning kings frequently held the office, strengthening the bond between temple and dynasty. The insignia of the priestess mirrored those of the earlier sacred ruler. She possessed a throne, a ceremonial chair for procession, and a scepter. She wore the same distinctive headgear, a wrapped crown or turban form, later enhanced with metal adornments. In visual representations, she appears in the flounced Kaunikese garment, her hair worn long and loose. Images from the Akkadian and earlier periods show similar figures. On one seal, a priestess identified as daughter of Naram Sin sits enthroned, wearing ritual dress and headdress. A female attendant stands before her. A sacred tree rises behind her seat. The scene emphasizes authority and sanctity. Earlier still, from the early dynastic period, votive plaques depict women standing behind libation scenes, their posture and dress echoing the later image of Enheduana. On these reliefs, the priestess does not pour the offering herself. Instead, she supervises while a male attendant performs the action. Her authority lies not in physical performance, but in ritual oversight. Cylinder seals from the same era show women seated on benches supported by carved legs, resembling those of bulls. In Mesopotamian symbolism, the bull was closely associated with divine strength, especially with the moon god. Seated posture signified elevated status. These women occupy the focal point of ceremonial scenes, receiving offerings or presiding over acts of worship. Archaeological finds from Mari reinforce this picture. Female figurines discovered in temples wear the same flounced garments and tall, conical hats. Some are shown seated on thrones whose armrests end in carved bovine forms. Others hold date branches, symbols of fertility and sacred authority. Across the late 4th and early 3rd millennia, representations of powerful women are surprisingly numerous. They appear alone, centrally positioned, and clearly dominant within ritual contexts. Over time, however, this prominence diminished. As urban institutions expanded and centralized authority intensified, religious and political leadership increasingly consolidated in male hands. By the 2nd millennium, the office of a priestess faded from practice. Gods no longer required human spouses. Sacred marriage rites continued in symbolic form, enacted between divine statues tended by temple personnel. The once prestigious titles held by earlier priestesses survived only as lesser designations. The limestone disc from Ur stands as rare and tangible testimony to an earlier era. It preserves not only the name of Enheduana, but the visual image of her presence within sacred space. Through it, the poet who once spoke in fervent hymns emerges briefly into view. Daughter of an empire builder, earthly consort of a god, patron of temples, political mediator, and one of the earliest recorded authors in human history.